Welcome to Myth Madness. Over the last few episodes, I've covered parts of the Garshaspnama, a Persian epic poem composed around 1066 AD. Most of my episodes this season leveraged the Shahnameh, a different epic poem that was composed in 1010 AD. The Shahnameh is considered the best example of Iranian literature. Its cultural importance is similar to the Iliad in Greek and the works of William Shakespeare in English. It tells the stories of many legendary Iranian kings and heroes. The Garshaspnama is all about the hero Garshasp. I wanted to cover this poem in full this season, as the Shahnameh includes very little information about Garshasp, and yet he is still a very important character in Persian mythology. So far, I've cut up my rendering of the Garshaspnama into multiple parts. In the first part, I covered Garshasp's ancestry and told how he was descended from the legendary king of the world, Jamshid. In the next part, I talked about how a young Garshasp slayed a dragon, and compared this to earlier traditions of Garshasp as a heroic monster slayer in Zoroastrian religious texts. In the parts after that, I shared how Garshasp went to India to defeat a rebellious prince, toured the land, went west to marry a princess, and finally returned to his homeland of Sistan and defeated his father's longtime enemy, the king of Kabul. Garshasp also founded a city. When Garshasp fought the dragon, he was following the orders of Zahhak, the semi-monstrous king of the world. When Garshasp led an army to India, he did so following the orders of Zahhak. And before Garshasp got married, it was Zahhak who hinted to Garshasp's father that the hero needed a wife. In this episode, Zahhak is going to have another quest for Garshasp to embark upon, and once again it's going to take Garshasp to a faraway land. When word of Garshasp's good and bad deeds in India and the West reached King Zahhak, a cloud darkened his mind. Zahhak viewed the young prince of Sistan as a growing threat, yet he couldn't harm him. The hero was too strong, beloved, and an influential leader of men. He had built a stronghold for himself, and Zahhak went to Sistan to see Garshasp's new city. When Zahhak arrived, Garshasp was everything you would expect from a loyal vassal. He paid tribute. He dismounted from his elephant before embracing the king. He kissed Zahhak's stirrups. He answered all of Zahhak's many questions. Zahhak looked at Garshasp and noted his heroic stature. His hands that could split mountains, his club that was like a dragon, his terribly strong elephant that he rode into battle. Zahhak thought that even if everyone else in the world was his enemy, this would be better than having Garshasp as an enemy. So, the king decided to put his concerns for the hero aside for the moment, pitched his tents, and rested for a few days in a good mood. But a few days later, Garshasp, Zahhak, and their men were hunting various wild animals in the countryside. Zahhak watched as Garshasp grabbed two large mountain goats with his bare hands and wrung their necks. Outwardly, Zahhak congratulated Garshasp, but within, his suspicions returned. He silently determined that if he did not want to lose his throne, Garshasp would have to be driven out of the kingdom, or ideally, killed in battle. So the wily Zahhak began to plot a trap the glory-seeking hero would not be able to resist. Later, at a feast, Zahhak lifted a cup of wine and praised Garshasp's strength and glory. He said it was thanks to the hero that he, the king, had peace of mind. And then Zahhak confided in Garshasp. He told the hero that while he, Zahhak, had destroyed all those who were his enemies, there was one man who was still a problem. This was an African king who flattered Zahhak when he was around, but mocked him when he was away. Zahhak didn't trust him. He told Garshasp that this king called Zahhak a man-eating demon, but also sneeringly called Garshasp a robber and a snake slayer. Zahhak also warned Garshasp about someone else, a demon named Minharis, which is the same name that appeared in the earlier prophecy given to Garshasp last episode. The Garshaspnama is not entirely clear here on the relationship between Minharis and the African king, but we can assume that Zahhak wants them both dealt with. Garshasp's interest was piqued, and he took Zahhak's bait. The hero promised to leave Sistan and bring back the heads of Zahhak's enemies. Garshasp's father, a Thrat, warned Garshasp not to accept these tasks from Zahhak. He guessed correctly that Zahhak was sending his son off in hopes he would be killed. A Thrat told Garshasp the journey would be long and take him across the sea and over mountains. Everyone who saw the monster Minharis lost their minds. He was 3 arms lengths in width and 60 feet tall. But Garshasp was not discouraged by the danger. He never was. Zahhak procured everything Garshasp would need on the journey. Camels, equipment, war elephants, swords, canopies, tents, servants, horses. Garshasp set off with an army of brave Iranians. On the way, Garshasp and his army came to an island called Alicante. When he found out about the hero's arrival, its king, Khotri, who was courageous and greedy for fame, ordered his own army to mobilize. The 2 sides came together in a great battle. Stones flew from one side, arrows rained down from the other. The fighters threw their lances in anger and excitement. In the center, Garshasp stood like a mountain. Khotri saw Garshasp and ran towards him. He hit Garshasp over the head with a large weapon made of carved fishbone, but the hero was unharmed. Garshasp struck him with his club, and the ground where Khotri stood became his grave. Seeing the death of their ruler, the Alicante army turned and ran, something which happens to many armies in the Garshaspnama. The Iranians chased them to their city and began to loot its houses, market, and alleys. But they found nothing of value. No gold or silver or fancy carpets. All of Alicante's doors, walls, and roofs were made of fish bones and wood. So, instead, the Iranians killed all the men, took the women prisoner, and loaded them into ships to take back to Persia to be sold as slaves. The ships left, leaving the remaining Iranian troops on Alicante. They would need the ships to return before continuing their voyage. While waiting, Garshasp wandered around, looking to take in the sights of this strange land. The only animals he saw were porcupines. But these porcupines were larger than buffalo and had spines like long roasting skewers. When the animals were agitated, they would launch these skewers like arrows. Garshasp and the Iranians excitedly hunted some of them. Meanwhile, a windstorm struck and caused the prisoner ships to float adrift at sea for 10 days. On the 10th day, they arrived at another island called Kaikara, which was ruled by a man named Kushmar. The islanders attacked the ships. Some of the Iranians were taken prisoner, some drowned, and many were killed. A single prisoner ship was able to escape, and the men returned to Alicante to report to Garshasp what happened. Of course, Garshasp felt he needed to avenge his men. He gathered the rest of his army and left in more ships for Kaikara. Along the way, the Iranians passed another island. A castaway appeared on the beach, shouting and waving a wool robe in the air. The Iranians stopped, and the castaway told them he had sought refuge there in a storm. But a terrible demon, or Div, lived on the island. When he roared, you lost your mind. From his teeth came lightning, and from his breath, clouds. The Div destroyed the man's ship and ate the rest of his crew. This Div was none other than Minharis. Lucky Garshasp. He found one of the objects of his quest without even trying. The castaway told Garshasp there was once a large city on the island, with countless children, men, and women. But Minharis emptied the city of its people. The monster lived in a cave further up the beach. When he spied a passing ship, he destroyed the ship and killed the crew. He often pulled sea monsters up onto dry land and dried them in the sun to eat. Garshasp barely listened. He had already resolved to go to shore and fight the Div. He went on foot and took no one with him, his bow on his arm, ready to shoot. Finally, he found Minharis in a deep cave. The monster had claws like a lion and 2 ears wide like curtains, tusks like a boar, and a yellow face. There were bones scattered all around him. Garshasp's heart began to beat wildly, and he asked the Creator for strength. He shot an arrow into the creature's eye. The Div roared and the island shook. Garshasp cut off the demon's hand and hit him with his club. Minharis was trapped. His ghastly lair was now a prison. He began to throw large boulders at Garshasp. The hero picked up his own large stone and threw it at the monster. Minharis was hit, collapsed, and lost his senses. Garshasp tied Minharis's hands and feet with a lasso and sawed off the monster's tusks. He called the Iranians into the cave, and together they dragged the captured Div back to the ship. Leaving the Demon's Island, the Iranians now sailed their ships to Kaikara. Before they got there, news of the approaching navy reached the island's inhabitants. Lookouts spotted them on the waves, with their sails raised to the sky. The army of Kaikara prepared for battle, and soon warriors covered the green hills, each carrying a banner that snapped in the wind. When Garshasp stepped onto the beach, he had his bold heroes line up amid the roar of drums and trumpets. There was no way for the Iranians to escape. They were committed to their vengeance. The king of Kaikara charged forward with his heavy fishbone club. He swung it at Garshasp, but the hero raised his shield and was saved. Then Garshasp jumped forward like a pouncing lion and struck the king on the neck with his sword. Once again, we have the death of a leader, causing their army to flee. The Iranians chased after them, killed whoever they found, and then plundered the cities of Kaikara. They entered the palace and loosened the shackles of the Iranian prisoners. Then they loaded up their ships and returned to Alicante, and from there the army marched to a place called Kairouan, where the African king Zahhak sent them to kill lived. Eventually Garshasp's army met the army of the African king in battle. They fought all day until evening came, but then even in the dark night they kept fighting by the silvery light of the moon. Garshasp captured the enemy general, cut off his nose and ears, burned his forehead in a couple places, and then sent him away to bring a message to his king. But the African king ignored it. So Garshasp had his secretary write a second message to the African king. He told the secretary to demand his surrender, but be excessively rude about it. The letter said, "Zahhak, king of the world, has learned of your secret activities against him, that you have a bad character and have lost your mind. You called me a snake catcher, and have harmed Zahhak's honor through your slander. You are arrogant, like the evil spirit Araman. Look what my brave club inflicted on bold Minharis. No one yet has been a match for my strength. If you do not submit now, I will turn your throne to dust and carry your head on the tip of a lance back to Iran." The letter was sent to the king of Kairouan. When the African king read the letter, he was so mad he beat Garshasp's messenger senseless. He ordered his men prepare for war. But one of the African generals knew there was no hope for his side. He took a number of his officers with him to Garshasp's camp and asked for the Iranians' mercy. Garshasp agreed that if the general swore his allegiance, Garshasp would make him king of Kairouan after their victory. So the African general and his men joined Garshasp's army. The war started. Soon there was blood everywhere, and the land was like a scratched face. Garshasp cried at the death and laughed at the swords. The bloodshed lasted 3 days, and finally the men stopped fighting. Once again, Garshasp and the African king exchanged insults by way of letters and messengers. The king challenged Garshasp to battle. He proposed a duel, and each of them could pick 50 men from their own armies to join them. Garshasp agreed. The men lined up and came together in a splendor of spears. Soon, corpses lay everywhere on the battlefield. All of the African king's men were dead, but only one of the Iranians. Garshasp went forward with a roar and shot the African king's elephant in the ear. It fell down, and Garshasp quickly jumped over its dead body and raised his club. He hit the African king on the head and knocked him dead. After the battle, Garshasp granted security to all of the common people, and made the general who joined him the king of Kairouan. His mission was now complete. It was time for Garshasp to lead his army home. After Kairouan, Garshasp passed through several villages and saw more idol temples and natural curiosities like he had during his trip through India. At one point, he found himself in a desert of pure sand. The land shifted and the sand shone brightly. Garshasp was amazed to find fish swimming through it as if it was water. Eventually, he came to the Mediterranean Sea and the land of Rum. He went to the beach and found it covered in strange eggs. He found ponds full of small people. If the people left the ponds for too long, they dried out and died. From there, the Iranians went to Andalusia, Spain, which is in the completely wrong direction, but hey, this is an epic poem and the geography doesn't make a lot of sense anyway. The Iranians visited Cordoba. One day, Garshasp picked up his bow to go hunting in the surrounding countryside and chased after a wild donkey. He lost sight of the donkey, and climbed a mountainside covered in thorns. On a narrow ridge, Garshasp and his companions found an old tomb carved out of the rock. Its walls were carved with strange characters that no one could read, and inside they found a large, frightening, half-mummified corpse. They looked around the mountain for a source of fresh water, and soon came to a hut next to a gently flowing stream. Garshasp washed his head and body and took a long drink. Out of the hut came a hermit, with a crooked back and leaning on his staff. He sat down next to Garshasp and began to speak to him in Greek. Garshasp asked him many questions: how old he was, if he had a family, why did he choose to live like a hermit. The hermit told him he was almost 900 years old, and that an owl is happy in an ugly wasteland, just like the nightingale is happy in a beautiful garden of paradise. The old man was another sage, and just like before, Garshasp has a long conversation with him about the Creator, about paradise, about what happens at the time of resurrection, how the path of religion is the food and clothing of the soul, and how death is the separation of the soul from the body. Garshasp also asked the hermit about the tomb high up on the mountain that he had found earlier. Whose bones were that big, and what did that inscription say? The hermit told Garshasp the inscription said, "The world grants no respite to anyone. Do not be too kind to a man, or do him any harm. Look at this deceased person and at his corpse. Fear the pure God who commands righteousness, because he destroys such a person." Garshasp kissed the hermit and prepared to leave, but the old man told him not to go just yet. The hermit said it was almost time for his long life to end. He asked Garshasp to rest and spend the night. In the morning, the hermit woke up and went down to the river to wash. He died, and Garshasp and the Iranians held a funeral for him. They built a mortuary tower to raise his body above the ground, a practice giving a clear link to Zoroastrianism, even though this epic poem was composed during Persia's Islamic period. Anyway, after a week of more traveling, the Iranians found a monument on another mountain. It was built of copper and iron, and was also covered in inscriptions. But this time, the language was Persian. The Iranians could read it. It said, "In my lifetime there were 300 kings. None were ill-disposed to me, none were equal to me. I acquired a lot of gold and hid everything under this monument." Reading this, Garshasp gave the order that the monument be broken. Underneath was a dungeon, and it was completely filled with gold. They took all of it out and loaded it onto the backs of 120 camels. With the gold, Garshasp had many bowls, tables, and cups made. He made a cup that was so big it had the weight of 10 men. On one side, Garshasp had an image carved of his ancestor Jamshid, enthroned and celebrating a banquet. This is an interesting decision, since Garshasp serves Zahhak, who was responsible for deposing Jamshid. On the other side of the cup, Garshasp had his own likeness made, showing him battling a dragon. In the future, every time he held a banquet, Garshasp would drink wine from this large cup. Finally, the Iranians returned to Roum. When the king of Roum, Garshasp's father-in-law, heard he was coming, he prepared a great feast for Garshasp and decorated his palace with garlands. He had 2 musicians, a pair of conjoined twins, play the harp for Garshasp. The king had built a palace for Garshasp and showed him around. It had 200 rooms, and each contained a throne. He showed Garshasp a garden that was as beautiful as the Garden of Paradise. There, peacocks strutted around in the shade of pine trees, and the flowers were said to be as bright as Ormazd, a description which gives another explicit link to Zoroastrianism. Garshasp stayed in Roum for a month, and then the king of Roum received a letter from Sistan. It was from Garshasp's wife and the king of Roum's daughter. She asked her father for any news of Garshasp, as it had been 5 years since he had set out on the quest Zahhak had given him, and she missed him terribly. Garshasp was brought to tears when he heard his wife's words. He missed her too, and prepared to immediately go home. Garshasp led the Iranians back to Jerusalem, where Zahhak had his palace. Zahhak welcomed Garshasp, and the hero gave him much of the tribute and treasure he had brought with him. He told the king everything that had happened with Minharis and the African king, and then had the chained demon brought out to show to Zahhak. They brought the monster out to the gallows, and many people fainted when they saw him. They hung Minharis, and then Zahhak sent Garshasp back to Sistan. Garshasp had conquered the world, and now returned home with a happy heart. He lived with his wife and father, and was free of hardship at least until it was time for a new adventure. But that's a story for another day. If you enjoyed this podcast, you can support the pod by getting the word out and sharing it with a couple friends. As always, thank you for listening.